So now before we actually start writing code, I'm gonna have to ask you a question. And you're gonna have to think in your heart of hearts what your answer is. And please realize that whatever you say this day, this may affect the rest of your career. Are you a tabs person or a spaces person? And if you're new, you have no idea what I'm talking about. Don't worry, hopefully you'll understand that joke in a bit. There was a show, there used to be a show on HBO called Silicon Valley, and the main character in the show was dating a woman who was also a programmer, and they started getting this discussion about whether you should use tabs or spaces, and one of them used tabs and one of them used spaces, and the entire relationship fell apart basically over that one particular argument. And maybe after today's lesson, you'll understand the joke there a little bit better. So anyways, what I want to be talking about is syntax, styling, and the importance of indentation in Python. So now one of the important things to understand about Python is structurally it is designed to make code relatively easy for people to be able to read, right? So there are other programming languages out there, such as JavaScript or PHP, where you can write code that functionally works perfectly, but nobody in the world can read. Nobody has any idea what's going on. This is called spaghetti code. So how the code blocks are laid out, essentially use something called delimiters, which are semicolons in PHP or JavaScript. And basically, as long as you put semicolons in the text somewhere, the interpreter knows what the hell to do with it. Again, one of the problems though is you as a coder might be just looking at this complete mess and not know where to go or not understand what the program is supposed to do. So one of the cool things about Python is it's actually structurally designed to hopefully be able to make things a little easier to read as far as programmers are concerned. So the delimiter, basically how you're able to build code blocks within the Python world, is by using indentation. So that's where you'll see indentation such as down here. So this is like an if statement. So we have the if statement here. We then indent for what's supposed to happen if the if statement is true. If we're doing a loop, so this is a for loop, we have the for loop, and then we indent, and this is what's supposed to happen during that for loop. And so the idea here is you're able to create relatively clean, relatively easy to read code so that is more manageable for other people to be able to maintain. One of the important things you have to be thinking about is whenever you're going to be writing code is what happens when you leave the organization and all of your code is given over to somebody else, right? One of the things that many coders say is they say, I know what my code does, and that's all that's important. But here's the thing. What if they get poached? Or what if they have a heart attack? What if something happens and they are no longer there to be able to maintain the code? Their code base goes over to somebody else. Is it going to be easy to read? That's a very important thing that you need to be thinking about, basically, especially as a professional. One of the issues we do run into, though, in the Python world is we have the Python syntax. And we talk about the syntax, that's things like these indentations. This is how you have to write the code. So you use colons for if statements or for while loops. You have to use a colon there. If you're going to do a print, you have to do the print command in a specific way. And you have to do it this way or the code will fail. That is syntax. But then you have something called styling. And styling is all the other fluff. Basically, how do things like naming conventions work? How do you make the code a little bit prettier so people understand what is going on? And so that is something that is entirely separate. And so whenever you're going to be dealing with styling, there's something called the PEP 8. So we go over here, I can show you. And this is called the PEP 8 style guide. And so this is not syntax, this is style. So basically how you're supposed to be able to write the code to make it prettier, right? It talks about consistency, it talks about things like code layout here. So this, as a styling guide, will show you what they say is correct, and they'll show you what they say is wrong. The important thing to understand is these code blocks will work, and these code blocks will work. Their idea is that it's easier to read these code blocks than it is to read these other code blocks. And so this is what's called the PEP 8 style guide, and it is definitely something that is good to go through and basically read through to understand basically, again, how can you make your code look prettier so that it's easier for other people to read. It is important to understand with whatever organization that you're going to, they may have their own styling requirements, so basically you may have to modify how you do your styling for whatever they need, but PEP 8 gives you a good place to start kind of grasping how the styling should work. Now let's take a moment to talk about indentations for code blocks. When we talk about indentations for code blocks, again, here's our if statement here, and here's a for loop here. And basically all we're saying is when we open up the statement, so there's try except statements, there's while loops, there's all kinds of different code blocks that you'll have. Basically, when you open it up, this will be on the far left-hand side of your screen. When you then go for whatever is going to be in that code block, what you're going to do is you're going to indent in, and then everything within that indented in code block is going to run under whatever has been called. So that's basically what we're talking about here with the indentations. As you have multiple things in here, so if you have a loop that then has an if statement, that then has a try except statement, all of that will get indented in as you're going down writing your code. And so this is one of those things to be thinking about. Basically, all the indentations do is it shows you more or less where the beginning and end of the code block is to try to be able to make it easier to read. Indents, whenever you do this indentation, they can either be 4 spaces or 1 tab. So space, 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 or 1 tab, you can do either of those. Spaces are technically preferred because, curiously enough, the size of a space, I didn't actually know this before I started teaching Python, but the size of a space is the same in all operating systems. So whether you're dealing with Windows, whether you're dealing with Linux, whether you're dealing with Mac, whether you're dealing with Potato OS, whatever it is, spaces are always the same size. So if you do 4 spaces, if you open that text file, basically Python is a text file, if you open it up in Nano on a Linux machine, or you open up a Notepad on a Windows machine, all the spaces will look the same, and that's why 4 spaces are preferred. Tabs, the actual size of tabs change between different operating systems, and you can actually reconfigure the size of a tab in an operating system. So basically the idea there is that tabs, you never really know how big or small they're going to be, so you might want to stay away from tabs. I'll tell you a secret, I'm kind of a tab person. Again, I try to tell you my bias and my problems. I know I'm supposed to do 4 spaces, but I'm a tab guy at the end of the day. I'm an NCSE from NT4. You tell me to type 4 spaces or 1 tab, I'm going to be honest with you, I'm just going to do 1 tab. The big thing to be thinking about with this, though, is that you can use either spaces, 4 spaces, or 1 tab, but you cannot mix them within the same script. So basically, whoever started writing the script, 10 years ago, whether they chose tabs or whether they chose spaces, you're going to have to stay to that standard. And again, this is one of those things you're going to be needing to think about from an organizational level. As you're writing your code, what does everybody else in your group do? Right? Again, that's going to be one of the important things. Like there's PEP 8 standards, and there's all these ways that you're supposed to do stuff. And then there's a reality. If you have 10 people on your team, what are the 10 people on your team doing? If 10 people on your team are using spaces, use spaces. If 10 people on your team are using tabs, use tabs. If 4 people are doing one thing and 6 people are doing another thing, then you need to tell the manager to do their darn job and get everybody on the same page, right? So that's the important thing to understand with indentations. Again, very, very simple. As we go through the code, it'll make a lot more sense to you, but either 4 spaces or 1 tab, just kind of think about why you're doing what you're doing. And now we get to variable names. So basically, whenever you're naming variables in different programming languages, right, there's going to be different styling, right? So in the JavaScript world, they like something called camelCase, right? Lowercase for the first word, uppercase for the second word, all smushed together. That's why it looks like a camel. For PEP 8 styling standards for the Python world, you are supposed to use something called snake case, all lowercase snake case. And what that means is that if you have multiple words in the variable name, they should be separated by an underscore. So lowercase, the word in all lowercase, underscore word in all lowercase, and this is basically how your variable name should look. Again, you can use camelCase, you can use all kinds of other weird ass naming conventions for your variables, but this is what's considered standard for the Python world. Now, the final thing to talk about in this section is namespace and module and function conflicts, especially with your variable names. So we'll talk about this more once we start talking about modules. One of the quirks about Python when you start writing code in Python is that you actually have to import modules and functions to be able to gain access to them within the Python script, right? So if you're using a programming language called like PHP, you can simply call the mail function or the random function or whatever else and get the functionality from that function to be able to use in your program relatively easily. The interesting thing with Python, again, from a security standpoint and consistency standpoint, is you can only use functions and modules that you actually import to the script at the top of the script. And why this becomes important is because sometimes you may not be thinking about it and you might call your variable names the same thing as what a function name will be later, right? So let's say you're writing your code and you're typing out your code and you need to be able to store something like a timestamp, right? So you need a timestamp or something like that. And so you're thinking, oh, I'm just going to call this time. I'll just call it time. And so you call it time and time equals whatever else and you go about your business. And then as you're writing out your code, you look at it and you're like, huh, I actually need a time module in order to be able to do certain things, or sleep in order to pause basically the program for a certain amount of time. So you then may import the time module with the sleep function later as you're writing the code. The issue might be though is as soon as you do that, you now have a variable called time and you imported a module called time and your script is going to have a small little heart attack. So one of the things to be thinking about basically as you write your code is try to come up with variable names that you do not believe will come into conflict with other things going into the future. Again, especially as you add functionality to your code, or more importantly, 3 years down the road when somebody else is trying to update your code, they may go through again, add a module that they don't think there's going to be any significant problem to. All of a sudden, your script fails because of things like how you named the particular variables. And so this is just one of those things to just kind of keep in mind as you're writing your code, because basically these namespace conflicts, as they're called, can cause you real issues. So that's all there is to this particular section. Again, everything will be a lot easier for you to understand as we actually start writing this code. The main takeaway that I would take from this particular session, though, is to go take a look at the PEP 8 styling guide, just so you have a better idea of how they want you to style or make your code, prettier, easier to read. So as you're going along and you start actually writing your scripts, not only do they technically work well, but they're also easier for other people to maintain as you move into the future.